Hello everyone, and welcome back to our channel, where we bring you face to face with figures from the past and talk about their history. When we think of Anne Boleyn, we almost always picture her tragic end: a queen, a wife, and a mother, wrongfully executed on the orders of a tyrannical king. Her story has become a cautionary tale. But what if that's the wrong way to look at her story? Was she really just a power-hungry seductress who flew too close to the sun? Or was she a brilliant, sophisticated woman whose modern ideas were simply too dangerous for the world she lived in? So, let's go ahead and get started. Our story begins not at the end, but in 1522. A young woman, not yet 21 years old, steps back onto English soil. She's been away for the better part of a decade, serving in the most glamorous and sophisticated courts of Europe. This is Anne Boleyn, but she is not the Anne who left. She is a stranger returning home. When she had left England as a young girl, she was little more than a pawn in her family's great game of ambition, sent abroad to become a lady-in-waiting. But the courts of Margaret of Austria and later Queen Claude of France were the glittering centres of the European Renaissance. And Anne, who was by all accounts incredibly intelligent and observant, soaked it all in. She returned to the comparatively rigid and conservative English court as a completely different person. She brought with her a new style, favouring the elegant, sleek French hood over the heavy architectural gable hood worn by English ladies. She had a new way of speaking, a new confidence, and a witty, flirtatious charm that was utterly continental. To the English court, she must have seemed like a creature from another planet. But it wasn't just fashion and flirtation that she brought back with her. In France, Anne had been exposed to the radical new religious ideas that were beginning to sweep across Europe. She was reading books and engaging with a kind of humanist, reformist theology that was all but unknown at the court of Henry VIII. She wasn't just a stylish woman. She was a woman with dangerous ideas. She was a spark of foreign fire in a court that was built of dry, old wood. And the king was about to notice. But to understand the woman who returned, we have to understand the family that sent her away. Because Anne Boleyn was not born into the highest ranks of the English aristocracy. She was a product of sheer, relentless ambition. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was a clever and determined courtier, a skilled diplomat who had worked his way up through talent and service to the crown. The Boleyns weren't part of England's ancient, blue-blooded nobility who could trace their lineage back for centuries. They were more like the Tudor equivalent of new money, a family on the rise, hungry for status and recognition. And for an ambitious family like the Boleyns, their children were their greatest assets. In the great, sprawling game of Tudor politics, children were the most valuable pieces on the board. Their marriages, their friendships, their very presence at court could make or break a family's fortunes. It's hard to imagine the kind of pressure these children must have been under. Every smile, every conversation, every dance was a performance with the family's future on the line. In fact, Anne wasn't even the first Boleyn girl to catch the king's eye. Her own sister Mary had already been Henry's mistress for a time, a role that brought the family immense favour and rewards. This was the world Anne was born into, a world where personal relationships were political tools, and a daughter's charm could be the key to the family's success. So when Anne was called back to England in 1522, it wasn't to become a star at court. It was to do her duty. The family had arranged for her to marry a distant Irish cousin, a match that would settle a long-running land dispute and secure a title for the Boleyns. She was, once again, a pawn being moved to a strategic square. But that plan, like so many plans at court, fell apart. And so, Anne found herself back in England, a highly polished and valuable piece in her family's game, but suddenly without a designated move. She was a woman trained from birth to seek advantage and secure power. And now, at the glittering, dangerous court of Henry VIII, she was finally free to play the game for herself. So Anne was back in England, a woman trained for a game she was now free to play for herself. But where exactly did she learn the rules? To understand the player, we have to go back and look at the school that trained her. When she was just a young girl, probably around 12 years old, Anne was sent away from home. Her first stop was the court of Margaret of Austria, the regent of the Netherlands. And this wasn't just any court. For me, this was probably the single most important influence on Anne's entire life. Margaret of Austria was one of the most powerful and respected women in all of Europe. She wasn't a queen just because she was married to a king. She was a ruler. She governed the vast and wealthy territories of the Netherlands on behalf of her young nephew, the future Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. She negotiated treaties with ambassadors, she managed a complex economy, and she was a major patron of Renaissance art and learning. She was, in every sense of the word, in charge. And a young, observant Anne Boleyn saw all of it. It's hard to overstate how radical this must have been for her. In England, a woman's power came from her husband or her son. Queens were consorts, powerful by association. But here, right in front of her, was a woman wielding real, direct political authority. A woman who was respected, obeyed, and even feared, all on her own terms. This experience must have planted a seed in Anne's mind, the idea that a woman didn't have to be a pawn. She could be a queen in her own right. It was a lesson she would never forget. But it wasn't just about politics. Margaret's court was a glittering hub of Renaissance culture. It was filled with art, music, and intellectual debate. This is where Anne's famous sophistication was born. She learned to speak French fluently. She developed her taste for fashion, and she received an education that was far beyond what most women, even noble women, could ever hope for back in England. This court gave her the blueprint for a new kind of womanhood, one based on intelligence, independence, and personal power. But her European education wasn't finished yet. Soon, her father's ambitions would move her from the Netherlands to an even more glamorous stage, the royal court of France. And it was there that she would add the final layer of polish and a whole new set of dangerous ideas to her growing arsenal. So Anne was moved from one powerful court to another, leaving the political world of Margaret of Austria for the glittering, and in many ways more complex, court of France. She was officially a lady-in-waiting to Queen Claude, the wife of King Francis I. By all accounts, Queen Claude's personal court was quiet, pious, and reserved. But the French court was a world of many layers, and Anne was now at the very centre of European culture and intrigue. It was here that she would master the art of courtly love. This wasn't the crude kind of affair her sister Mary had with King Henry. This was a sophisticated game of wit, poetry, and flirtatious conversation. It was about capturing a man's attention and holding it, about being desirable but remaining unattainable. For a clever young woman like Anne, it was a game she was born to play. She learned how to be charming, how to be challenging, and how to use her intelligence as her most captivating feature. But it wasn't just a game of romance she was learning. The French court was also a hotbed of new religious ideas, and the king's own sister, Marguerite de Navarre, was at the heart of it. Marguerite was a brilliant writer and a patron of reformist thinkers. In her circle, Anne was exposed to the New Learning, a humanist, evangelical form of Christianity that encouraged a personal relationship with God, and most radically, reading the Bible in your own language, not in Latin. For a woman as sharp and curious as Anne, this must have been electrifying. It was an idea that placed personal faith above the rigid structures of the church. It suggested that anyone, even a woman, could have a direct line to God without a priest as a middleman. This was a profoundly empowering and deeply dangerous idea to hold. So when Anne's time in France came to an end, she had been completely transformed. She had the polish of the most fashionable court in Europe, but she also had the substance of a radical thinker. She had learned how to play the game of courtly love, but she now had a faith that told her she was more than just a piece in someone else's game. She was armed with both charm and conviction. And now, this fully formed, sophisticated, and radical young woman was being called home to a court that had no idea what was about to hit it. And so, Anne was back at the English court, a woman armed with French fashion and radical faith, waiting for her moment to shine. That moment came on Shrove Tuesday, 1522, during a grand court pageant called the Château Vert, or the Green Castle. This was the Tudor equivalent of a blockbuster production, a massive spectacle where ladies of the court played virtues like beauty, honour and kindness, defending their castle from the king and his men, who played the roles of vices. Now, the English court had a very specific idea of what made a woman beautiful. The ideal was a fair-skinned, blonde, blue-eyed woman. Someone gentle, quiet, and submissive. Think of the Queen herself, Catherine of Aragon, a woman praised for her piety and her quiet dignity. The court was full of these English roses, all conforming to the same pale, demure standard. And then there was Anne. She was cast as the virtue of perseverance, and she must have stood out like a raven among doves. She wasn't the pale English rose. By all accounts, she had dark olive skin, thick, dark hair, and eyes so dark they were almost black. In a court that prized fairness, her darkness was exotic, and to some, even a little unsettling. And of course, she wore the sleek, elegant French hood, which revealed her face and hair, a stark contrast to the heavy, boxy gable hoods worn by the other English ladies, which hid them away. But it wasn't just her looks, it was her energy. While the other ladies were trained to be demure and agreeable, Anne was witty, sharp, and flirtatious. She had that French confidence, that ability to engage a man in a conversation that was both a challenge and a delight. She wasn't just there to be looked at, she was there to be listened to. And one man, in particular, was looking and listening very, very closely. King Henry VIII himself was part of the pageant, and as he and his men attacked the castle, his eyes fell on Anne. For the king, who was growing tired of his aging wife and was used to the predictable flattery of the court, Anne must have been a revelation. Here was a woman who was not just beautiful, but interesting. A woman who didn't just bow, but sparred with you. A woman who held your gaze instead of looking away. He was utterly captivated. The game of courtly love that Anne had mastered in France was about to begin on a much, much bigger stage. And this time, the prize wasn't just a courtier's affection. It was the King of England himself. But while the King of England was now utterly captivated by this strange, dark-eyed woman, Anne's attention was apparently elsewhere. She wasn't just a passive object waiting to be chosen. She had a heart, and it seems she had already given it to someone else. His name was Henry Percy. He was the heir to the incredibly powerful Earl of Northumberland, and he was serving in the household of the most powerful man in England, besides the king himself, Cardinal Wolsey. By all accounts, Anne and Percy fell deeply and genuinely in love. This wasn't just the witty, detached game of courtly flirtation she had mastered in France. This was real. And in secret, they took a monumental step. They became betrothed, pledging to marry one another. For Anne, this must have felt like a triumph. After her family's plans for her had fallen through, she had, on her own, secured a brilliant match with a man she actually loved. She was finally taking control of her own life, writing her own story. But in the court of Henry VIII, no secret stayed secret for long. When Cardinal Wolsey found out about the betrothal, he was furious. Whether it was because Percy was already promised to another, or because the king had already expressed his own interest in Anne, we don't know for sure. But Wolsey moved swiftly and brutally. He publicly summoned the young Henry Percy and humiliated him in front of the entire court, berating him for promising himself to a foolish girl of no real importance. The engagement was forcefully broken. It's hard to overstate the sheer humiliation of this moment for Anne. It wasn't just a private heartbreak, it was a public shaming. She was dismissed, cast aside, and sent away from court in disgrace. Her hopes for love and for a future she had chosen for herself were shattered by the whim of a powerful man. She had been taught a brutal lesson about the true nature of power at court, and in Cardinal Wolsey she had found her first great enemy. But while Anne was away from court, nursing a broken heart and a deep-seated hatred for Cardinal Wolsey, a much, much bigger crisis was brewing. A crisis that had been simmering for years at the very heart of the Tudor dynasty. It was known as the King's Great Matter, and at its core, it was simple. King Henry VIII had no son. For a modern audience, this might not seem like a huge deal. But for the Tudors, it was everything. Their dynasty was still new, having seized the throne only a few decades earlier, after the bloody and chaotic Wars of the Roses. Without a clear male heir, the fear was that England would plunge right back into civil war the moment Henry died. And at the centre of this crisis was the Queen, Catherine of Aragon. For nearly 2 decades, she had been a loyal, devoted, and popular queen. But her personal life had been a string of heartbreaking tragedies. Time and time again, she had become pregnant, only for it to end in a miscarriage, a stillbirth, or a son who died within weeks. It's hard to even imagine the immense pressure and personal grief she must have carried. Only one child had survived to adulthood, a healthy, intelligent daughter named Mary. But in the ruthless world of 16th century politics, a daughter wasn't enough. England had never been successfully ruled by a queen in her own right, and the idea of it terrified the English nobility. It was seen as a recipe for disaster. So as Catherine grew older, passing her childbearing years, Henry's anxiety turned into a kind of religious panic. He became convinced that his marriage was cursed by God. He found a passage in the Bible, in the book of Leviticus, that said a man who marries his brother's wife will be childless. And of course, Catherine had first been married to Henry's older brother Arthur before he died. For the king, this was the answer. His marriage wasn't just unlucky, it was sinful in the eyes of God. He was growing tired of his aging, pious wife, and he was desperate for a son to secure his legacy. The stage was set for a radical change. Henry needed a new wife. And just as he came to this world-shattering conclusion, a certain dark-eyed young woman, with a sharp wit and a radical faith, was about to return to court. And so, with the king's great matter consuming his every thought, Henry made his move. He began to openly pursue Anne Boleyn, showering her with gifts, letters, and the kind of intense attention that only a king can give. By all accounts, he expected a very simple and familiar outcome. He was the King of England. When he desired a woman at court, she became his mistress. It was the way of the world. And this was a path the Boleyn family knew very well. Anne's own sister, Mary, had already been the king's mistress for several years. It was a role that had brought the family immense favour and wealth for a time. But it was a temporary position. Mary was eventually cast aside when the king grew bored, married off to a minor courtier, her reputation forever marked by the affair. She was a favourite, but she was disposable. Anne had seen firsthand what it meant to be the king's plaything. She had learned from her sister's experience, and she had certainly learned from the humiliation of her broken engagement to Henry Percy. She understood that the power of men like Wolsey and the king could give, but it could also take away in an instant. So, when Henry VIII, the most powerful man in her world, made it clear that he wanted her in his bed, Anne did the unthinkable. She said no. But this wasn't a simple, final rejection. This was something far more clever, something Henry had never encountered before. Instead of pushing him away, she drew him into the sophisticated game of courtly love that she had mastered in France. She would accept his letters and write witty, challenging replies. She would engage him in flirtatious conversation, holding his gaze, matching his intellect. She captivated him, charmed him, and made herself the absolute center of his world. But she would not become his mistress. She offered him her heart and her mind, but she denied him her body. For a king like Henry, a man who had never been denied anything in his life, this was utterly baffling, and it was intoxicating. The one woman he couldn't have was suddenly the only woman he wanted. For me, this is the moment Anne truly takes control of her own destiny. She wasn't just rejecting the king, she was fundamentally changing the rules of the game. She had seen that the role of mistress was a dead end. It was a position of temporary favour, not permanent power. Anne was playing for a much, much bigger prize. And so, the game began. A game played not in person, but through a series of passionate, desperate letters. Miraculously, 17 of Henry's letters to Anne survive to this day. But what's so fascinating, and what tells us so much, is that we don't have a single one of Anne's replies. All we have is the king's side of the conversation, and it reveals a man completely undone. These are not the letters of a powerful king to a potential mistress. They are the letters of a man who is begging. He writes about the great agony of her absence. He signs his letters as her servant. In one, he sends her a drawing of a stag, a symbol of a man hunted by love, and writes that his heart belongs to her alone. This was a king, a man who believed he was chosen by God, humbling himself completely before a woman who was, in the eyes of the world, his subject. For me, this is where you see Anne's genius in action. These aren't just love letters, they are the documents of a political negotiation. Every passionate plea from Henry is an offer, and every time Anne withholds her affection or her physical presence, she is raising the price. She had learned the hard way that a man's favour could be given and taken away in an instant. She had seen it happen to her own sister. Anne was making it absolutely clear, in the only way she could, what her terms were. She was not interested in being a favourite. She was not interested in gifts and titles that could be stripped away. She was holding her virtue, her very self, as the ultimate bargaining chip. It's hard to even imagine what her replies must have been like. They must have been masterpieces of wit and evasion, promising just enough to keep him obsessed, but never, ever yielding. She was teaching the King of England a lesson he had never had to learn before, that some things could not be taken, they had to be earned. And her price was not a title or a bag of gold. Her price was the crown itself. So Henry was trapped. He had offered Anne everything a king could possibly offer, and she had made it clear that the only thing she would accept was the one thing he couldn't give: the crown of England. His wife, Catherine of Aragon, was a popular and deeply respected queen, and the Pope in Rome would never, ever grant him a divorce. But Henry was a man who believed he could bend the world to his will. And as his obsession with Anne grew, so did his conviction that his first marriage was not just inconvenient, but sinful. He went back to that passage in the book of Leviticus, the one that said a man who marries his brother's wife will be childless. For years, this had been a source of private anxiety, a nagging fear that God was punishing him. But now it was no longer a fear, it was a solution. And this is where Anne Boleyn's true and often overlooked power comes into play. She wasn't just a passive observer in all of this. She was an active participant, an intellectual force driving the king forward. Remember all those radical ideas she had soaked up in France? The belief in a personal faith, the idea that the Bible, not the Pope, was the ultimate authority. She now began to use them. For me, this is the most critical part of Anne's story. She wasn't just the prize Henry was fighting for. She was his partner in the fight. She began to feed him the very arguments he needed to hear. She gave him forbidden books by reformist thinkers, books that argued the Pope was not infallible, that a king's conscience, guided by Scripture, was the highest authority in his own kingdom. She was, in essence, giving him the theological permission to do what he already wanted to do. She encouraged his scruple of conscience, validating his belief that he was on a righteous crusade, not just a selfish quest for a new wife and a male heir. It's hard to imagine how intoxicating this must have been for Henry. Here was this brilliant, captivating woman, not just offering him love, but offering him a spiritual justification for his actions. The personal had become theological. Anne was no longer just the object of the king's desire. She was becoming the architect of his new faith. Together, they were building the intellectual framework for a revolution. They had their argument, blessed by Scripture and their own intertwined ambitions. Now, they just had to convince the world, and their first and greatest obstacle would be the man who held the keys to the kingdom in Rome. And so, by the spring of 1528, the great project was in full swing. Henry and Anne were a team, united in their goal. They were exchanging reformist books, building their theological case, and preparing for a long, hard fight against the Pope. It must have felt like they were on the cusp of victory, that their combined will could reshape the world. But then, in the summer of that year, something happened that no king could command and no argument could defeat. A terrifying, invisible enemy returned to England. It was the sweating sickness. This wasn't like the other plagues. It was a mysterious and horrifyingly swift disease. A person could be perfectly healthy at breakfast and dead by dinner. It caused intense fear and panic wherever it appeared, because it was so fast and so seemingly random. And this time, it struck right at the heart of the court. One of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting died suddenly, and then the news came that chilled Henry to the bone. Anne herself had caught the sweat. Henry, who was a notorious hypochondriac and lived in mortal fear of disease, reacted with pure panic. He immediately sent her away from court, back to her family home at Havre Castle. It's hard to imagine how terrifying this must have been for Anne. Not only was she facing a deadly illness, but she was being abandoned by the man who claimed to love her more than life itself. The king fled, moving from house to house, trying to outrun the sickness that was consuming his kingdom and the woman he so desperately wanted. He must have been frantic, his entire world, his plans for a son, his very future, all hanging by the thinnest of threads. And then the unthinkable happened. The king himself fell ill. The sweating sickness had found him. The entire future of England, the Tudor dynasty, and the great matter all rested on whether a man in the grip of a violent fever would survive the night. If Henry died, it was all over. Anne's ambition would die with him. But then, miraculously, the fever broke. Both Anne and Henry, separated by miles but joined by the same brush with death, began to recover. For Henry, this was not just a lucky escape. It was a sign from God. He was convinced that their survival was divine proof that their union was meant to be, that their cause was righteous. They had faced death together and won. This shared ordeal changed everything. It forged their relationship in a fire far hotter than courtly love or political ambition. Henry's obsession was now a holy mission. He was more determined than ever to have Anne as his wife, and he would let nothing, not the Pope, not the Emperor, and certainly not the laws of man, stand in his way. So, with their survival from the sweat seen as a divine seal of approval, Henry and Anne were more determined than ever. The time for waiting was over. Henry decided to force the issue. The plan was to hold a special court right there in England to rule on the validity of his marriage to Catherine. This was called a legatine court, and it would be overseen by two of the Pope's representatives, Cardinal Wolsey and a new cardinal sent from Rome named Campeggio. For Henry, this was it, the final move. He was bringing the trial to his home turf, where he and his loyal minister Wolsey could control the outcome. He must have felt certain that this was just a formality, a final piece of theatre, before he could finally cast Catherine aside and make Anne his queen. The court opened in the summer of 1529 at Blackfriars in London, and it immediately became the most dramatic public spectacle the country had seen in years. Catherine of Aragon, a woman who had been Queen of England for 2 decades, was put on trial like a common criminal. But she would not go quietly. In a moment of pure, heartbreaking drama, she refused to stand before the judges. Instead, she walked across the hall, knelt at her husband's feet, and gave the speech of her life. She spoke not as a queen, but as a wife. She reminded Henry of her loyalty, of her love, and of the many children she had lost for him. She swore on her soul that she had been a virgin when she married him, making their union valid in the eyes of God. It's hard to imagine the scene. A proud, pious queen publicly begging her husband for justice. The entire court was moved to tears. And then, having said her piece, she simply stood up and walked out, refusing to ever return. The damage was done. Catherine had won the hearts of the people, and she had completely undermined the court's authority. Cardinal Campeggio, who was secretly under orders from the Pope not to make a decision, used the chaos to stall. Weeks turned into months. Finally, he announced that the court would adjourn for the summer, following the legal calendar in Rome. No verdict would be given. For Henry, it was a complete and utter disaster. He was publicly humiliated, and his grand plan had collapsed into nothing. He was furious, and he needed someone to blame. And in the shadows, Anne Boleyn saw her chance. She had never forgotten the man who had destroyed her first love and publicly shamed her. Cardinal Wolsey. For me, this is the moment her long-simmering hatred finally boiled over into action. She had the king's ear, and she began to whisper. She reminded Henry of all of Wolsey's failures, of his immense wealth and his own ambition. She painted him as the man who had failed to deliver the king's great matter, the man who was more loyal to the Pope than to his own king. Henry, enraged and looking for a scapegoat, listened. The king's favour, which had made Wolsey the most powerful man in England, was withdrawn in an instant. He was stripped of his offices, his palaces, and his wealth. The great cardinal, who had ruled England for 15 years, was broken. Anne had finally had her revenge. So Cardinal Wolsey was gone. Anne had her revenge, and Henry had his scapegoat. But after the dust settled, the fundamental problem hadn't changed. The king was still married to Catherine, the Pope was still refusing to cooperate, and Anne was still waiting. The fall of the great cardinal had created a massive power vacuum, but it hadn't provided a solution. And into this void stepped a man who, by all accounts, should never have been anywhere near the levers of power. His name was Thomas Cromwell. He was not a nobleman. He was a blacksmith's son, a lawyer, a moneylender, and a man of immense, ruthless intelligence who had worked his way up from nothing. And most dangerously of all, he had been Cardinal Wolsey's most loyal and trusted agent. After his master's fall, Cromwell's own future looked very, very bleak. But Cromwell was a survivor. And more than that, he was a political genius who saw a path forward that no one else had even dared to imagine. While the great nobles and bishops were still trying to figure out how to persuade the Pope, Cromwell had a much simpler and much more terrifying idea. Why not just get rid of the Pope altogether? The idea was breathtaking in its audacity. He argued that Henry didn't need the Pope's permission. As King of England, Henry was the supreme authority in his own realm. All he had to do was declare it. He could break with Rome, make himself the head of the church in England, and then grant his own annulment. It was a solution that was clean, absolute, and revolutionary. But an idea, no matter how brilliant, is useless without a champion. And Cromwell, a man with no title and powerful enemies, couldn't get to the king on his own. He needed an ally, and he found one in the most powerful person at court, Anne Boleyn. For me, this is one of the most fascinating and effective partnerships in English history. They were an unlikely pair. Anne, the sophisticated reformist lady, and Cromwell, the pragmatic, low-born fixer. But their goals were perfectly aligned. Anne's evangelical faith, which placed scripture above the Pope, gave Cromwell's political plan the theological cover it needed. And Cromwell's legal mind offered Anne the one thing she desperately wanted: a clear, workable path to the crown. It was an alliance born of pure necessity. Anne became Cromwell's voice in the king's private chambers, championing his radical ideas, persuading Henry that this was not just a political move, but a righteous one. In return, Cromwell became Anne's instrument in Parliament, the architect who could turn their shared vision into law. Slowly, methodically, they began their work. With Anne's protection and Cromwell's direction, a series of laws began to snake their way through Parliament, each one a small cut, slicing away at the power of the Church in Rome and transferring it to the king in London. The revolution had begun. And so, As Cromwell's legal revolution began to dismantle the old world brick by brick, a new one was being built in its place. And at the very centre of this new world, holding court like a sun with planets forming around her, was Anne Boleyn. The years of waiting, of playing the game from the sidelines, were over. Her power was no longer just a reflection of the king's desire. It was becoming a source of light, all on its own. It must have been an incredible and deeply strange time for the English court. Anne began to hold her own court, separate from the king's. She was surrounded by her own ladies-in-waiting, her own chaplains, and a growing crowd of courtiers who understood that she, not the forgotten Queen Catherine, was the future. Foreign ambassadors, who once would have paid their respects only to the official queen, were now directed to Anne. She would receive them, speak with them about policy, and charm them, all with the confidence of a woman who knew her position was secure. For me, this is where you see Anne's political skill come into its own. She wasn't just enjoying the perks of her new status, she was actively using it. She became a major source of patronage, which was the true currency of power at court. She secured positions for her supporters, she promoted reformist clergymen, and she used her influence with the king to reward her friends and punish her enemies. She was building her own power base, ensuring that when she finally did wear the crown, the court would already be hers. She was queen in all but name. But this strange, unprecedented situation couldn't last forever. She had the power, the influence, and the court of a queen, but she still lacked the title. Catherine was still, in the eyes of the law and the rest of Europe, Henry's true wife. The revolution was moving forward, but it wasn't moving fast enough. And as 1532 drew to a close, a new and urgent secret would make the final shattering break with Rome not just a desire, but an absolute necessity. That urgent secret, the one that made the break with Rome an absolute necessity, was the one thing Henry had been dreaming of for years. Sometime in late 1532, Anne knew she was pregnant. This was, of course, incredible news. It was the validation of everything they had fought for. But it was also a terrifying crisis. The clock was now ticking, faster than ever before. If Anne gave birth before she was legally Henry's wife, the child, the long-awaited heir, would be illegitimate. The entire years-long struggle would have been for nothing. So, on September 1st, 1532, just before a major diplomatic trip to France, Henry did something absolutely unprecedented. In a lavish ceremony at Windsor Castle, surrounded by the great nobles of the realm, he made Anne Boleyn the Marquess of Pembroke. And this wasn't just another gift of jewels or land. This was something different, something revolutionary. For the first time in English history, a woman who was not born a royal princess was being granted a major hereditary peerage in her own right. This title wasn't hers because of a father or a husband. It was hers and hers alone. It's hard to overstate how shocking this must have been to the old nobility. For me, this is the ultimate symbol of Anne's peak influence. This wasn't just a title to make her look good at court. The legal document creating the title specifically stated that it could be passed down to her heirs male. Henry wasn't just honouring the woman he loved. He was creating a noble lineage for the son he was so sure she was carrying. He was making her a great magnate of the realm, a woman whose status was independent, secure, and permanent. She was no longer just Anne Boleyn, the king's favourite. She was now a great noble in her own right, second only to the royal dukes. She had the title. She had the king's absolute devotion. And she was secretly carrying his heir. All that was left was to make it official. They would marry in secret, and then Cromwell would have to deliver the final, earth-shattering blow to the old world and make her a queen in the eyes of everyone. And so, with her new title secured and the secret of a royal heir growing inside her, Anne and Henry prepared for their final public move before the wedding. In October of 1532, they travelled to the English-held territory of Calais for a grand summit with the King of France, Francis I. This wasn't just a diplomatic visit. It was a carefully staged piece of political theatre. The entire point was for Henry to present Anne to his most important European ally, not as his mistress, but as his future queen. It must have been the ultimate triumph for Anne. After years of being the shadow queen, hidden away while Catherine held the official title, she was now stepping onto the international stage. She had her own magnificent court, her own retinue, and she was treated with all the deference and honour due to a queen. The gamble paid off. King Francis, a shrewd politician who understood which way the wind was blowing, played his part perfectly. He met with Anne, danced with her, and presented her with a magnificent diamond. In the rigid, symbolic world of 16th century diplomacy, this was a massive statement. He was publicly signalling his acceptance of Henry's new partner. He was treating Anne like a queen. And with that public triumph, something private and monumental seems to have finally shifted. For 6 long years, Anne had held the king at arm's length. She had played the game of courtly love, offering him her mind and her heart, but never her body. She had made it clear that she would not be a mistress. Her price was the crown and nothing less. Now that price had all but been paid. Sometime during that trip to Calais, with the approval of the French king secured and the promise of marriage seemingly unbreakable, it's almost certain that Henry and Anne finally became lovers. After 6 long years of desperate letters, political warfare, and shared ambition, their union was finally consummated. They returned to England no longer just a king and his intended, but as a couple bound by a shared secret and a physical union. The revolution was no longer just an idea, it was now a reality, and with a child on the way, the clock was ticking faster than ever. And so, they returned to England from the triumphs of Calais. The public validation from the French king was a massive victory, and their new physical intimacy must have felt like the final seal on their long-fought battle. But beneath the surface of this victory, there was a quiet, growing panic. The clock was ticking. Anne's pregnancy was no longer a distant hope. It was a biological reality, a 9-month countdown that could not be paused or negotiated with. Every single thing they had worked for, every political battle, every theological argument, all of it hinged on this one simple fact. The child had to be born legitimate. If Anne gave birth while Henry was still officially married to Catherine, their heir would be a bastard, and the entire revolution would have been for nothing. So, in the cold, pre-dawn hours of January 25th, 1533, a small, secret ceremony took place. This wasn't a grand royal wedding. There were no cheering crowds, no lavish feasts, no foreign ambassadors. It was a rushed, clandestine affair, likely held in a private room at Whitehall Palace, with only a handful of trusted witnesses present. It was an act of pure, desperate necessity. In their own minds and in the new world they were creating, they were finally husband and wife. But in the eyes of the rest of Christendom, the King of England was now a bigamist. The secret wedding had solved the immediate problem of their conscience, but it had created a massive, public legal crisis. The race against time had just entered its final frantic lap. The burden now fell squarely on one man's shoulders. Thomas Cromwell had to make this secret, illegal marriage legal, and he had to do it before the Queen's belly began to show. And so, with Cromwell's legal machine working at a frantic pace, the final obstacles were swept away. In May of 1533, the new Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, a man loyal to Anne and the new cause, officially declared Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon null and void. Just a few days later, he declared the king's marriage to Anne to be good and valid. The legal path was finally, officially, clear. Finally, on June 1st, 1533, the day arrived. Anne Boleyn's coronation. This was the moment she had fought for, waited for, and risked everything for. The spectacle was everything she could have dreamed of. It was a magnificent, glittering procession through the streets of London. Anne, heavily pregnant, sat in a litter of white and gold, her dark hair flowing freely beneath a golden coronet. The city's guilds had prepared lavish pageants, music played, and the great nobles of the realm marched in all their finery. For Anne, this must have been the ultimate vindication. After 7 long years of being the other woman, the Shadow Queen, she was finally being crowned Queen of England in the sight of God and everyone. It was her absolute triumph. But as this magnificent procession made its way through the city, something was deeply wrong. The streets were lined with people, but they were silent. There were no cheers, no shouts of, "God save the Queen." In fact, when the court officials ordered the crowds to show respect, many people pointedly refused to even take off their hats. The people of London loved Catherine of Aragon. She had been their good, pious, and charitable queen for over 20 years. To them, Anne was not a righteous reformer. She was a seductress, a homewrecker, the great whore who had cast their true queen aside. It's hard to imagine what that must have felt like for Anne, to be at the absolute peak of your power, to have achieved the impossible, and to be met not with cheers, but with a wall of cold, silent disapproval. She had won the king. She had won the crown. But she had not won the people. But the cold reception from the crowds was a problem for another day, for now all eyes were on the Queen's growing belly. The entire kingdom, the entire revolution, it all came down to this one thing, the child Anne was carrying. Henry, of course, was absolutely certain it would be a boy. He had defied the Pope. He had torn his kingdom from Rome. He had cast aside a beloved queen of 20 years. In his mind, God owed him a son. The royal astrologers and physicians all predicted a prince. The name was already chosen, either Henry or Edward. Elaborate plans were made for a magnificent tournament to celebrate the birth. Letters announcing the arrival of a healthy prince were even drawn up, ready to be sent across Europe. The pressure on Anne must have been unbearable. Her entire future and the future of her family rested on the sex of the child she was about to deliver. She had promised the king a son and heir. It was the very foundation of their new world. Then on September 7th, 1533, the moment came. The Queen went into labour at Greenwich Palace. The court held its breath. It was a girl. It's hard to imagine the crushing weight of that disappointment. For Henry, it was a public and personal humiliation. He had moved heaven and earth for this, and all he had to show for it was another daughter. He already had a daughter, Mary. The grand tournament was immediately cancelled. The birth announcements had to be hastily corrected, with a small S awkwardly squeezed onto the end of the word prince to make it princess. For Anne, it must have been terrifying. She had done her duty. She had delivered a healthy, living child, which was no small feat. But she had failed in the one task that truly mattered. She had promised a son, and she had not delivered. For me, this is the first hairline crack in the foundation of their relationship. The child was named Elizabeth after Henry's own mother. She was healthy and strong, and for now, Henry was willing to believe that a son would surely follow. But the unspoken promise had been broken. The magic of their great cause had been dented. Anne was still the queen, but now she knew she had to get pregnant again, and quickly. And next time, it had to be a boy. But the birth of a healthy daughter, while a blessing, did not solve the king's great matter. It just changed the problem. Now, Henry didn't just need a divorce. He needed to force an entire kingdom to accept that his legitimate, pious, and popular first daughter, Mary, was now a bastard, and that his new daughter, Elizabeth, was the true heir to the English throne. And so, in 1534, Thomas Cromwell's legal machine produced its most brutal and far-reaching weapon yet, the Act of Succession. The Act legally enshrined everything Henry and Anne wanted. But it came with a terrifying new requirement, an oath. Every single one of the king's subjects of any importance would be required to swear an oath to uphold the Act. It was a loyalty test on a national scale, and refusing to swear was not just dissent. It was treason. And for the most part, people swore. Faced with the choice between their conscience and their heads, most nobles, bishops, and gentlemen chose their heads. The political terror was working, but not everyone could be so easily broken. Two men, two of the most respected and beloved figures in the entire kingdom, refused. The first was Bishop John Fisher, a man of deep piety and learning. The second was a man who had once been the king's closest friend and advisor, the brilliant lawyer and humanist Sir Thomas More. For a man like More, who had served as Henry's Lord Chancellor, this was an agonizing decision. He was willing to accept Anne as queen as a matter of political reality, but he could not, in good conscience, swear that the king's first marriage was invalid or that the Pope had no authority. It was a choice between his king and his God. It's hard to imagine the pressure they were under. The king, who had once loved and admired both men, begged them to swear. But they would not. They had drawn a line in the sand, a line that their faith would not allow them to cross. And so, the two elderly, respected men were arrested and sent to the Tower of London. For over a year they languished in the Tower, hoping the king would show mercy. But Henry, and perhaps Anne, saw their refusal not as a matter of conscience, but as a direct challenge to their authority. In the summer of 1535, they were both tried and condemned to death for treason. First, the frail Bishop Fisher was beheaded. A few weeks later, it was Thomas More's turn. He walked to the scaffold with a quiet dignity, famously declaring that he died, the king's good servant, but God's first. The terror had begun. Henry and Anne now had their succession, secured by law and enforced by the executioner's axe. But it was a victory that came at a terrible price. They had proven they were willing to kill anyone, even old friends, who stood in their way. The glittering court of a new beginning was now stained with the blood of martyrs, and for a queen whose position depended entirely on the king's love and the birth of a son, it was a very, very dangerous world to live in. But while the public face of the new regime was the executioner's axe, behind the scenes, Queen Anne was waging a very different kind of war, a war of ideas. For me, this is where we have to look past the gossip and the tragedy to see the real Anne Boleyn. She wasn't just a woman who wanted a crown. She was a true believer, and now that she had power, she was determined to use it to reshape the very soul of England. As queen, she filled her household with reformist chaplains. She became a major patron for scholars who were translating and promoting the new learning. She was actively using her influence and her money to protect these men from the very laws her own government was creating, intervening time and time again to save reformers who had been arrested for heresy. She was turning her court into a safe haven for the Reformation. And her most radical act of patronage involved a book so dangerous that possessing it was a crime. It was the Bible, translated into English by a fugitive scholar named William Tyndale. It's hard for us to understand now, but this was revolutionary. The old church believed that only priests could interpret God's word. The idea that an ordinary person could read the Bible for themselves, in their own language, was a direct attack on their power. And Anne didn't just own a copy. She had a specially illuminated version made, and she placed it in the king's own hands, encouraging him to read it. She wasn't just trying to secure her own crown. She was trying to change the way an entire nation prayed. And yet, all the reformist books in the world, all the secret patronage and theological debates, couldn't solve the one fundamental problem that haunted their marriage. Anne still had not produced a son. After the birth of Elizabeth, there had been at least one more pregnancy, maybe two, but they had ended in heartbreaking miscarriages. The pressure on her must have been immense, a constant, silent weight on her shoulders. Every month that passed without a new pregnancy was a quiet failure. Every courtier's glance was a question. She had promised the king a son, and the debt was coming due. And Henry, a man of enormous appetites and very little patience, was beginning to get restless. He had fought a war against the world to win this woman, but the thrill of the chase was over. The reality of marriage had set in, and as he had done with Catherine of Aragon, his eye began to wander. He started paying attention to other ladies at court, offering small flirtations and tokens of his favour. This was a familiar pattern, and a traditional queen was expected to handle it with what was called prudent silence. Catherine of Aragon had endured Henry's affairs for years, turning a blind eye, maintaining her dignity, and praying. That was the job. But Anne was not Catherine. She had not been raised to be silent. She had fought to be Henry's partner, his equal in intellect and spirit. She saw his flirtations not as a king's casual pastime, but as a betrayal. And she did not stay silent. She confronted him. The same sharp wit that had once captivated him was now a sharp tongue. The same fiery spirit he had found so intoxicating was now a jealous temper. For me, this is the fatal flaw that begins to unravel everything. The very qualities that made her a revolutionary mistress made her an impossible queen in Henry's eyes. He had wanted a woman who would challenge him, but he had not expected that challenge to continue after the wedding vows. Her French confidence, her refusal to be a quiet, submissive wife, was now becoming a dangerous liability. The dynamic that had brought them together was now beginning to tear them apart. But the arguments and the jealousies, the sharp words and the wandering eyes, all of it could be fixed by one thing: a son. And so, in 1534, when Anne became pregnant again, it must have felt like a miraculous reprieve. This was it. This would be the boy who would secure the Tudor line, silence the doubters, and heal the growing rift in their marriage. The entire court held its breath, waiting for the news that would justify everything. But the pregnancy ended in another heartbreaking loss. We don't know if it was a miscarriage or a stillbirth, but the result was the same. The cradle remained empty. Then, in 1535, there was another flicker of hope, another suspected pregnancy that came to nothing. For Anne, the pressure must have been suffocating. She had promised the king a son, and time again, her body had failed to deliver. Her confidence must have been cracking, replaced by a cold, creeping fear. And for Henry, that fear was turning into a familiar, chilling dread. He had lived this story before. The hopeful pregnancies, the crushing disappointments, the string of lost children. It was the exact same pattern that had convinced him his marriage to Catherine of Aragon was cursed by God. He had torn his kingdom apart, defied the Pope, and sent men to their deaths, all to escape that divine punishment. For me, this is the moment that Henry's great love for Anne truly begins to die, replaced by a kind of religious terror. He started to wonder if he hadn't escaped God's judgment at all. What if he had just traded one sinful marriage for another? He began to tell his closest confidants that he believed he had been seduced into this marriage by sortileges and charms, by witchcraft. It was a way of explaining the unexplainable. It wasn't that he was unlucky, it was that he had been tricked by the devil. He was trapped in the same nightmare all over again. And so, as the year turned to 1536, the court was a place of quiet terror. Anne was desperate, her hopes pinned on one last pregnancy, and Henry was trapped, convinced he had been bewitched into a cursed, fruitless marriage. The great love story had become a horror story, and both of them were looking for a way out. And then, in early January, news arrived from Kimbolton Castle that must have felt, at first, like a divine intervention. After years of lonely exile, her health finally broken by grief and isolation, Catherine of Aragon was dead. For Anne, it's easy to imagine the immense, complicated wave of relief she must have felt. The great rival, the woman whose shadow had loomed over her for a decade, was gone. The true queen, in the eyes of the people, was no longer a living challenge to her own title. It must have felt like the final obstacle had been removed. But this is where the story takes one of its most tragic and ironic turns. Because while Anne and her family celebrated, they had failed to understand the terrible new reality of the situation. For me, this is the moment Anne's fate was truly sealed. As long as Catherine of Aragon was alive, Anne was, in a strange way, completely safe. To get rid of Anne while Catherine lived, Henry would have had to admit his first marriage was valid all along, undoing the entire revolution and making himself a fool in the eyes of the world. Catherine's life was the legal shield that protected Anne's position. But now, Catherine was dead. And in the eyes of God and all of Catholic Europe, Henry was no longer a bigamist. He was a widower. He was, for the first time in his adult life, completely and indisputably free to marry whomever he chose, with no need for a pope's permission or a special act of parliament. The only thing standing in the way of a new marriage and a new queen was Anne herself. And then, on January 24th, 1536, the same day that Catherine of Aragon was being laid to rest, the final, fatal blow fell. The court was celebrating with a grand jousting tournament. Henry, always eager to prove his strength and virility, was competing. He was in full armour, charging down the tilt-yard, when his horse stumbled. The king was thrown, and then the unthinkable happened. The massive armoured warhorse fell on top of him. For 2 terrifying hours, the King of England lay unconscious. It's hard to even imagine the sheer panic that must have ripped through the court. If the king died, what would happen? The succession was a mess, and Anne, the pregnant but unpopular queen, would be left completely vulnerable. For Anne, who heard the news from a distance, the shock must have been cataclysmic. Her entire world, her very life, depended on the man who was now lying silent and still. Days later, the physical toll of that terror became a reality. Anne went into premature labour. She had lost the baby, and when the physicians examined the fetus, they discovered the final heartbreaking tragedy of Anne's life. It was a boy. It was the son she had promised, the son that would have saved her. Desperate and heartbroken, she tried to explain it to Henry when he finally came to her chambers. She blamed the shock of his accident, the terrible fear she had felt for his life. But the Henry who stood before her was not the passionate lover who had moved heaven and earth to win her. He was cold. He was cruel. He looked at his weeping wife, the woman for whom he had remade his kingdom, and delivered his final verdict. I see that God will not give me male children. The love story was over. The rise was finished. The fall had begun. And so, the king walked away. The man who had written desperate love letters, who had called himself her servant, who had defied the Pope and broken his kingdom in 2 for her, was gone. In his place was a cold, terrified tyrant, convinced that God had cursed him once again. And as Henry's love for Anne died, his eye had already found its next object. A quiet, pale and gentle lady-in-waiting named Jane Seymour. She was everything Anne was not. She was meek, she was submissive. She was the perfect image of a traditional obedient wife. She was a port in the storm of Anne's fiery personality, and the king was desperate for a safe harbour. But Henry was not a widower. He was still married, and to get his new wife, he needed to get rid of his old one. And for that, he turned to the man who had made the new world possible, Thomas Cromwell. For me, this is the final, brutal turn of the political wheel. Cromwell was a pragmatist. He had allied with Anne to rise, to push his reformist agenda, and to serve the king. But now, the king's will had changed. Anne was no longer an asset, she was an obstacle, and Cromwell, the ultimate survivor, understood the new reality instantly. His loyalty was to the king, and to his own survival. If the king wanted Anne gone, Cromwell would find a way. The architect of Anne's rise would now become the architect of her destruction. The fall, when it came, was terrifyingly swift. The very qualities that had made Anne so captivating were now twisted into weapons against her. Her French confidence and sharp wit were reframed as evidence of a monstrous ego and a loose moral character. Her circle of friends, poets and musicians, the sophisticated court she had built, would be accused of being her lovers. The game she had played so brilliantly was now used to build a case of adultery, incest and treason against her. It was a fiction, a brutal and efficient legal murder, but it served its purpose. In the end, Anne Boleyn, The woman who had taught a king about personal faith and royal supremacy was condemned by a court that had already decided her guilt. She had flown higher than any woman of her generation, and the fall was absolute. But when we strip away the politics, the religion, and the tragedy, who was the woman at the center of it all? What did this person, who changed the course of English history, actually look like? This is one of the great, enduring mysteries of Anne's story. We know from contemporary accounts that she was not a conventional beauty by Tudor standards. In a court that prized pale skin, blonde hair, and blue eyes, Anne was a raven among doves. She had a dark, olive complexion, thick, dark hair, and eyes so dark and expressive they were considered her most captivating feature. She was slim, elegant, and carried herself with a confidence that many found alluring and others found arrogant. But finding her true face in a portrait is almost impossible. After her execution, Henry ordered that all images of her be destroyed. It was a systematic attempt to erase her from history. The portraits we have today are almost all copies of a lost original, and they vary wildly. Some show a stern, plain woman, others a sly and knowing beauty. Her enemies, of course, were not content to just call her plain. They invented monstrous physical deformities to match her supposed spiritual corruption. They whispered that she had a sixth finger on one hand, a projecting tooth, and a large mole or goiter on her neck that she conveniently hid with her fashionable high-collared chemises. There is no credible evidence for any of this. It was character assassination of the most literal kind, an attempt to paint her as a physical monster to justify her destruction. And so, even in death, Anne remains elusive. Her true face, like her true character, is a battleground of competing stories. Was she a power-hungry seductress, a righteous reformer, or a brilliant woman who simply flew too close to the sun? Perhaps the answer is that she was all of these things. A woman of fierce ambition, genuine faith, and fatal confidence, who played the game of power and lost, but in doing so, changed the world forever.